Welcome to another custom-tailored deep dive designed specifically for you. I'm really glad you could join us today.
Glad to be here.
Yeah, if you've been with us before, you know that I'm that person who will happily devour a massive stack of really dense books, articles, research notes, and academic papers.
Oh, absolutely.
And then, sit down to pull out the absolute most fascinating, sometimes mind-bending nuggets of knowledge to share with you. And today we have a really incredible journey ahead of us.
It's a heavy one.
It is. We are looking at a stack of sources that at first glance might seem like they belong in completely different libraries.
I mean, it is genuinely one of the most eclectic and frankly challenging stacks we've ever tackled. We're crossing multiple disciplines here.
Exactly.
Yeah.
On one side of the desk, we have these hard sociological analyses of radicalization, terrorism, and insurgency. We're looking at a massive data set from the RAND Corporation on how terrorist groups historically end, studies on global insurgencies like the FMLN in El Salvador, analyses of apocalyptic groups like Aum Shinrikyo in Japan, and even criminal investigation manuals.
And then right next to that, literally right next to that, we have a profound, highly detailed ethnographic and political text by Leyva Solano.
Yeah.
And this text focuses on the Zapatista movement in Mexico, specifically looking at their transnational networks, their internal evolution regarding gender and sexual diversity, and what the author describes as a global war against humanity.
Right, and trying to synthesize the RAND Corporation's kinetic data with an indigenous, anti-capitalist ethnographic study is
No small feat.
no small feat at all. But when you overlay them, the contrast they create regarding how marginalized groups resist systemic violence is incredibly revealing.
It really is.
And to really see that contrast, we're going to do something a little different today. We are flipping our usual script. As requested for this specific deep dive, our mission is to start in a very dark place. We're going to begin by looking at some incredibly sobering global statistics regarding violence against women and sexual diversities.
Because we really have to understand the scale of the crisis first.
Exactly. Then we are going to transition into exploring how the Zapatista movement has historically and contemporarily responded to these exact crises.
Which culminates in a really fascinating way.
It does. It's all going to culminate in a highly symbolic, almost cinematic recent event involving a voyage across the Atlantic Ocean that challenges 500 years of history.
It's a vast narrative arc.
Yeah.
But before we get into the statistics or the history, we really need to pause and establish some absolute concrete ground rules for today's discussion.
Yes, thank you. This is non-negotiable. We must explicitly state to you, the listener, that the sources we're unpacking today contain highly, heavily politically charged content.
Very true.
The materials range from intense anti-capitalist and anti-patriarchal theoretical frameworks to deep clinical analyses of global terrorism, armed insurgencies, and state-sanctioned violence. So we want to make it absolutely clear, we are not taking any sides here.
None at all.
We are not endorsing the viewpoints of the original authors, the political movements discussed, or the state actors mentioned. Our job is simply to impartially report on the content provided in your stack and help you understand the ideas contained in the original source material.
Precisely. We are operating purely as your guides through this information architecture. Our goal is to synthesize the data, outline the arguments presented by these various authors, and help you see the big picture they are collectively painting.
We are examining their frameworks, not adopting them.
Exactly.
Perfect. So with that mission and that context firmly in place, let's dive in. And we have to start with the sobering reality presented right at the beginning of the Leyva Solano text. Because before we talk about any specific political movements, any insurgencies, or any historical events, the sources direct our absolute attention to the sheer staggering scale of global violence against women and sexual diversities.
And it is staggering.
I have to admit, reading through these numbers, it stops you in your tracks.
The statistics provided in the source material are very difficult to process, but the author uses them deliberately. They aren't just there for shock value.
No.
They are utilized to establish a baseline. The text is trying to demonstrate what it describes as a systemic, ongoing global crisis, a baseline condition of reality that the subsequent political movements are reacting to.
So let's look at the data points on feminicide first. The text highlights statistics from the 2017 United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime report.
Right, the UNODC data.
According to this UN data, 137 women are murdered every single day globally.
And the text emphasizes a particularly chilling detail within that aggregate number. 58 out of every 100 of those women murdered are killed by their partners or family members.
God, that specific detail really changes the framing, doesn't it?
It does.
It highlights that the violence is deeply intimate. It's occurring within homes, within families, what should theoretically be the absolute safest spaces for these individuals. It's not just random street violence, it's systemic relational violence.
Yes, and the geographical data the sources provide adds another layer to this. The text notes that Latin America is the second region in the world with the highest rates of feminicides, seating right after Africa.
Right.
And it specifically calls out countries like El Salvador, Honduras, Brazil, and Mexico as having alarmingly high prevalence and raw numbers of these murders.
Okay, so we have these massive, horrifying numbers, but what the source material does next is where the theoretical heavy lifting begins. The text attempts to synthesize the why behind these numbers.
Right, moving from the data to the mechanism.
Exactly. And to do this, it brings in the analysis of a scholar named Silvia Federici. And I want to spend some time here because Federici posits a theoretical framework where capitalism and globalization function essentially as a literal war against women.
It's very strong phrasing.
It is. Now, let me push back on this for a second. When I read that, it felt like a massive, almost conspiratorial leap.
I can see why you'd say that.
Is she saying there's a boardroom of global capitalists actively plotting violence against women as a strategy? Or is she saying this violence is a tragic byproduct of an economic system that just refuses to value human life?
Right.
Because calling it a literal war is a huge claim.
It is a huge claim, and it's important to unpack exactly how Federici constructs that argument in the text, because she isn't arguing for a literal smoke-filled room of conspirators.
Okay.
She is arguing for a structural systemic mechanic. The source breaks down her argument by looking at the foundational requirements of capitalism as she defines them. Federici argues that capitalism fundamentally requires the constant lowering of the cost of labor to maximize profit and accumulation.
Right, basic profit motive. Keep overhead low.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But to achieve that incredibly low cost of formal labor, she argues, the system relies heavily, almost entirely, on a massive foundation of unpaid reproductive and domestic labor.
Ah, okay.
We are talking about childbirth, childcare, household management, cooking, elder care, community maintenance. This is the labor that literally produces and maintains the workforce itself.
And historically and systemically, this immense burden of unpaid work has been forced onto women.
Precisely.
So, if I'm understanding her framework, the argument is that the global economic system only functions profitably if it can essentially get a free ride on the foundational care work that keeps the actual workforce alive, fed, and functioning.
That is the core of her thesis, as presented in the text. This reliance creates a dynamic where the condition of women is structurally inherently devalued by the system.
Because it's free.
Right. Because their most essential labor is unpaid and entirely unacknowledged on a macroeconomic ledger. Their social standing is correspondingly diminished. They're rendered economically invisible, yet entirely necessary.
Okay, I followed the economic argument, but how does Federici connect that structural devaluation to the physical violence, the 137 murders a day?
This is where the concept of the war comes in. She argues that this systemic violence isn't just random disconnected crime. In her framework, it acts as a very specific message of terror to the broader population.
Wait, terror.
Yes, because women represent life, care, and the literal reproduction of society itself. Widespread, unpunished violence against them serves to terrorize, discipline, and subjugate the population as a whole.
Wow.
The text quotes her explicitly on this. She says it sends a message of, careful, we have no limits. It's a way of breaking community cohesion so that economic extraction can continue unimpeded.
That is a very dark, heavily structural way to interpret those UN statistics. It frames interpersonal violence as a symptom of a macroeconomic engine.
It does.
And the text doesn't stop there. It applies a similar lens to violence against transgender individuals and sexual diversities.
Right.
The sources highlight statistics from the Trans Murder Monitoring Project, reporting that between 2008 and 2020, 3,664 trans people were murdered globally.
Furthermore, the text details what it describes as direct, state-sanctioned institutional violence. It's not just economic neglect, it's active criminalization.
Yeah, this part was wild to read.
It cites that 69 United Nations member states still explicitly criminalize consensual same-sex acts between adults.
69.
And even more severely, 11 states still condemn homosexual conduct with the death penalty. We're also pointed to a 2015 Inter-American Commission on Human Rights report that outlines lethal and non-lethal violence against LGBTQ plus individuals across the Americas.
Right, detailing torture, inhuman treatment, excessive use of force, and arbitrary detentions by state actors. So we are looking at a trifold crisis in the text: intimate interpersonal violence, deep economic structural violence, and direct state-sanctioned institutional violence. Now, I want to bring in some of the other sources from our stack here, specifically the DialNet text on ethnic radicalism and the Criminal Investigation Manual,
Those are very relevant here.
because they provide some fascinating broader context regarding how violence operates in a society before groups ever decide to fight back.
Yes, the DialNet text is very useful here. It discusses how violence is fundamentally a social relationship.
A relationship.
Yes, it emphasizes a point that aligns perfectly with the statistics we just reviewed. It asks us to look at the violence exercised by the state and by dominant society against minorities long before those minorities ever react, organize, or radicalize.
So it frames violence not just as an explosive event like a bomb going off or a protest turning into a riot, but as an ongoing, quiet relationship of power, suppression, and daily indignity.
Precisely. The core takeaway these combined texts are trying to convey is that the murders, the criminalization laws, the economic devaluation, these are not isolated anomalies. They are portraying a broader, highly integrated systemic phenomenon.
The baseline.
Yes, this is the baseline reality, the persistent war that these subsequent political movements we're going to discuss are reacting against. You cannot understand the resistance without understanding the immense pressure of the initial violence.
And that pivot leads us perfectly into the next major theme of our deep dive. We've established the sheer scale of the global and institutional violence detailed in the sources. Now, we need to look at how the Zapatista movement specifically frames, explains, and fights this violence.
Right, their unique lens.
The text introduces a Zapatista theoretical framework to make sense of this reality, which they refer to as the four wheels of capitalism.
This framework is a crucial conceptual tool in the source material. It takes the very academic macroeconomic theories of someone like Silvia Federici and translates them into a localized, actionable political critique.
Let's lay out those four wheels clearly. According to the text, the Zapatistas define the four wheels of capitalism as exploitation, dispossession, contempt, and repression.
If we unpack those terms based on how the text utilizes them, exploitation refers to the literal extraction of labor and natural resources without fair compensation. That's the classic Marxist critique of surplus value.
Right.
Dispossession is the physical taking of land, territory, water rights, or cultural heritage, often through state force or corporate maneuvering.
And then the last two seem more social and violent.
Yes. Contempt is the cultural and social devaluation of a people. It's treating indigenous populations, women, or sexual minorities as lesser, invisible, backwards, or inherently disposable.
And repression.
Repression is the sharp end of the stick. It's the use of police force, military violence, cartels, and institutional power to keep those people in line when they try to resist the first three wheels.
Now, the texts explicitly connect the systemic violence against women and diverse bodies that we just discussed to these four wheels. But to understand exactly how that connection works, we have to grapple with a complex theoretical term that the author uses heavily: heteronormativity.
Right. Heteronormativity can sound like incredibly dense academic jargon, but we can break it down. Think of it like a piece of foundational software that a society runs on.
Software. Okay.
In the context of these sources, heteronormativity is basically the societal default setting. It's the hard-coded assumption that everyone is or absolutely should be heterosexual, and that there are only two distinct, immutable genders, man and woman, that have very specific, biologically determined traditional roles to play.
I like that software analogy, because it's almost like trying to use a piece of software that was strictly coded for only two types of inputs.
Exactly.
If you try to input anything else, the system doesn't just fail to recognize you, it actively throws a severe error code. And the text is essentially arguing that society's error code is marginalization, contempt, and violence.
That's a highly accurate way to visualize the author's point. According to the source material, stepping outside that heteronormative box immediately triggers those last two wheels of capitalism.
Contempt and repression.
Yes. When individuals don't fit the strict binary, they immediately face social contempt. They are marginalized, mocked, deemed unnatural, or labeled as a threat to the social order.
Right.
And this contempt inevitably clears the way for repression, which manifests as the horrific statistics of violence, murder, and state criminalization we discussed earlier. You are punished for crashing the system.
What I appreciate about the Leva Solano text is that it doesn't just leave this as an abstract academic theory. It grounds it in a very concrete, localized, and honestly heartbreaking ethnographic example.
It
The
does.
text dives into a study conducted in a Maya Celtal community in the municipality of Ocosingo in Chiapas, Mexico.
Yes, the text brings in specific research done by young indigenous investigators who were looking at the lived realities of youths who do not fit the traditional gender binary within their own rural communities.
The text introduces a specific localized term here, Antsiwinik. Now, before we get into the violence they face, I want to make sure I understand this term accurately based on the text. Is this just the local Celtal word for gay or trans?
The researchers are very careful to distinguish the nuances here. In the text, Antsiwenik is translated roughly as a person who can pass as a man and at the same time as a woman.
Okay.
But the author clarifies that it isn't just a direct, simple translation or a one-to-one synonym for Western concepts like homosexual or transgender. It historically carries specific, localized cultural weight and context within the Maya Celtal worldview.
But the text also notes that in the modern, current context described by the researchers, this term has been somewhat degraded, right?
Yes.
These youths are often derogatorily viewed simply as man-woman in a mocking sense.
Yes, the cultural context has shifted, often due to outside influences, which leads to immense friction.
I was reading through the section detailing the discrimination these specific Antsiwinik youth face in Ocosingo, and the sheer hostility is staggering.
It's off.
The text details how they face severe verbal and physical abuse. And it's not just from strangers in the street, it's from their own parents. It's from teachers, from classmates.
Everywhere in their environment.
The text specifically mentions evangelical pastors in the community who explicitly single them out and label them as dangerous from the pulpit. The researchers quote parents claiming that these identities didn't exist before and insisting that external people put these ideas in the youth's heads.
Which is a classic mechanism of contempt denying that a marginalized identity is organic to the community, labeling it as a foreign contagion.
Right.
But what the expert researchers highlight in the text is a profound, tragic paradox regarding where this study took place. This ethnographic study was conducted in a technical secondary school between 2016 and 2018. And this specific school officially operated with an intercultural approach.
Right. I saw that. It's an educational framework that is formally, officially supposed to value diversity, pluralism, and different ways of being.
Yet, despite this official, progressive-sounding intercultural label, the text notes that the school completely and utterly invisibilizes these diverse identities. The teachers and administrators fail to address the topic adequately, if at all.
It's like a corporate diversity brochure that completely ignores the actual marginalized people suffering in the building.
Exactly.
And the result, according to the text, is that these youths are left completely isolated to suffer the devastating effects of the wheels of contempt and repression. The study documents the outcomes: profound low self-esteem, constant fear, poor academic performance, and very often the overwhelming desire or the absolute necessity to flee their own community just to survive.
It perfectly illustrates the author's broader point. Systemic violence isn't just a distant UN statistic about state laws. It operates intimately on a micro level in rural homes and secondary school classrooms, enforcing that default setting of heteronormativity through localized daily repression.
That localized reality in Ocosingo is intense, and it sets the stakes perfectly for the major narrative pivot in our deep dive. We've spent a lot of time establishing the mechanics of global and local violence as described by the sources. Now, we are going to shift the narrative sequence to look at the Zapatista response to these specific issues.
Right.
How does a rebel movement actually dismantle those wheels?
To understand their contemporary response, the text argues we have to go back in time. We need to understand the foundational structural changes within the Zapatista organization regarding gender, long before the recent oceanic voyages the text covers.
Exactly. Let's paint the scene. Take yourself back to the early 1990s, leading up to the massive 1994 Zapatista uprising in Chiapas. The text highlights a foundational document, the Law of Revolutionary Women.
This was a pivotal moment in the movement's history. The text details the deliberate historical efforts from the very inception of the Zapatista armed uprising to ensure that women were not relegated to just being passive supporters or domestic help for the insurgency.
Right.
They ensured that women held actual, formal leadership and command positions within the organizational structure.
And the text provides a really powerful, specific testimony to illustrate how this happened. It quotes a figure named Mayor Ana Maria, dating back to 1994. She describes the political conditions in the indigenous communities before this structural shift.
Yes.
She notes that previously, when organizers and political cadres arrived in communities to teach or organize, only the men would attend the meetings. Only the men would sit in the political study circles. The women were kept in the kitchens.
But the women in these communities demanded a change. Mayor Anna Maria's testimony vividly describes how the women demanded to be organized, to represent something politically, to physically do something for the struggle beyond domestic support.
I love this specific, profound quote the text highlights from her testimony. She says, "If men are going to study or learn things, why not us?"
This is a great quote.
She talks about how women explicitly demanded the opportunity to train militarily, to become insurgents, to prove that they could bear the physical and intellectual weight of the work just as well as the men.
What's crucial here is the directionality of this change. The inclusion of women and the subsequent law of revolutionary women wasn't a top-down mandate issued by a disconnected, enlightened male leadership.
Right, it wasn't handed to them.
According to the text, it was a fierce, grassroots demand welling up directly from the women in the communities themselves. They forced the issue.
And that grassroots demand fundamentally reshaped the entire DNA of the movement. It changed the physical makeup of the rebel militia, and it deeply altered the autonomous civic governance structures they eventually built.
Like the Juntas de Buen Gobierno.
Yes, the councils of good government and the various community health and education committees. It hardwired female participation into the system.
It is a profound historical shift. But the Leyva Solano text doesn't stop its analysis in 1994. It contrasts that foundational moment of women's inclusion with the present day, specifically introducing a linguistic and political concept that represents the next evolution of this struggle.
The Otroa.
Yes, the Otroya.
The source material spends significant time explaining the Zapatista use of the letter X or the suffix oa to denote non-binary and diverse identities. So you see words like compañeroas instead of just compañeros or compañeras.
It's highly intentional.
Yeah.
We need to explain the political context behind this linguistic choice because the author frames it as a core tactic of resistance.
Okay.
Using the letter X or O is described in the text as a deliberate linguistic rebellion. It is a conscious daily effort to break out of the male-female dimorphism, that strict two-input software binary we talked about earlier, which is legitimized and enforced by dominant heteronormativity.
By actively changing the structure of the language they speak, they are actively changing the conceptual framework of their reality, making tangible space for identities that the default setting tries to invisibilize or erase.
Precisely.
And the text introduces another complex, really fascinating term here to explain the depth of this inclusion: ancestrality.
Ancestrality is a vital concept in the text's argument. In the context of these sources, ancestrality means that gender fluidity and non-binary identities are not just modern, Western, urban concepts that have been recently imported into these rural indigenous communities via the internet or NGOs.
Right. It's not a new trend they're adopting to seem progressive.
Exactly. Rather, the text argues that these fluid identities have deep, ancient, ancestral roots within indigenous Mesoamerican cultures themselves, long before European contact.
So when the Zapatistas use terms like Otroa, or when they elevate someone like Mara Jose, who we will talk about soon, they aren't just adopting a new political label. The text frames it as a profound act of historical reclamation.
They are actively reclaiming a deeply rooted part of their own cultural history and social fabric that was violently suppressed by centuries of colonization and the imposition of modern Western heteronormativity.
It's a reclamation of their own totality. They are placing diverse bodies not at the margins of their movement, but as an integral ancestral part of their community fabric. It's a direct challenge to the wheel of contempt.
It absolutely is.
This internal evolution is fascinating, but as the text shows, the Zapatistas didn't just stay in the Lacandan jungle and theorize. They took this evolving framework outward. This brings us to their contemporary political action, expanding beyond their own borders.
The movement began to explicitly connect its internal struggles against the four wheels of capitalism with broader national and international struggles of marginalized groups.
The text introduces us to a major historic political initiative from 2005 called the Sixth Declaration of the Lacandan Jungle, and the massive subsequent political tour known as La Otra Campaña, the Other Campaign.
This was a nationwide, highly ambitious effort by the Zapatistas to travel across Mexico to listen to and organize with marginalized groups in every state, completely outside of the traditional electoral political party system.
They weren't looking for votes, they were looking for alliances.
Right.
And the text details a very specific, poignant historical moment during this campaign that perfectly illustrates their approach to diverse bodies. It describes a day when Subcomandante Marcos, serving as Delegate Zero, and the Zapatista delegation visited a place called La Merced.
For context, La Merced is a well-known, historic, deeply working-class neighborhood in the heart of Mexico City. It's an area with a very dense, complex, and often harsh social fabric, known for its massive markets and its significant population of street-based sex workers.
The text describes how, during this visit to La Merced, the Zapatista delegation didn't just give a speech. They sat down and listened directly to sex workers and individuals with diverse bodies, specifically noting their meetings with members of grassroots organizations like Brigada Calajera and the Red Mexicana de Trabajo Sexual, the Mexican network of sex work.
And the stories they heard that day, as detailed in the source, were harrowing. They listened to testimonies of severe daily injustice and discrimination.
The text explicitly lists the horrors these groups recounted: constant, violent police raids, relentless extortions by both authorities and cartels, forced evictions from their neighborhoods, and the outright unsolved murders of homosexuals, lesbians, and transgender people.
It was a direct, face-to-face confrontation with the extreme, lethal end of the violence we discussed at the very beginning of this deep dive.
If we connect this encounter to the bigger picture the author is painting, the text shows how the Zapatista movement took these testimonies and integrated them. They incorporated the specific rights and struggles of urban sex workers into their broader national anti-capitalist platform.
And this is where the text makes a crucial, really nuanced distinction about what these sex workers were actually asking for. When I first read this, I assumed the goal would be simply to help them exit sex work.
Right, that's the standard assumption.
But the source is very specific on this point. The text explicitly notes that the sex workers in these organizations did not demand the abolition of prostitution.
Exactly. They weren't asking to be saved in a moralistic sense. Instead, they demanded better, safer working conditions. They demanded the defense of their labor conquests and human rights.
And, most profoundly, they demanded the eradication of the structural causes, the extreme poverty, the lack of education, the systemic marginalization that forced people into commercial sex out of pure desperation in the first place.
This specific set of demands aligns perfectly with the Zapatista theoretical framework we discussed earlier. The sex workers' demands are, in essence, a direct fight against the four wheels of capitalism.
Specifically, they are fighting against severe exploitation in their daily labor and the deep, often lethal marginalization, contempt, and repression they face from both society and the state apparatus.
By integrating these specific demands into the Sixth Declaration, the Zapatistas were expanding their anti-capitalist struggle to include the concrete, lived realities of urban sex workers and sexual diversities. They recognized their struggle as the same war.
Exactly.
So we've seen them issue these grand national declarations. We've seen the historical shifts in the 90s, but rhetoric is cheap and political tours end. I want to know what happens when the cameras leave. How does a rebel movement actually protect marginalized genders on a random Tuesday in their own territory?
That's a great question.
How does this work outside of just having women in military command roles or issuing inclusive political statements?
The source material addresses this exact question by taking us inside the MEA, the Zapatista Autonomous Rebel Municipalities.
Right.
These are the actual physical, on-the-ground governance structures and territories they have built and defended in Chiapas.
The text details how these autonomous structures provide concrete institutional support. It's not just high-level theory, it's daily bureaucratic practice.
Specifically, the text points to the critical realms of health and education. It describes how workshops, courses, and training sessions are regularly given to Zapatista health and education promoters within these autonomous municipalities.
And who is giving these workshops? This is the cool part. The text notes that they are often conducted in direct collaboration with the very networks they met during La Otra Campaña years prior, like the Brigada Calajera.
This highlights the ongoing, practical nature of their solidarity network. It's not just a handshake for a photo op, it's a transfer of knowledge. The text explains their specific approach to sexual and reproductive health in these workshops. It notes that it is taught fundamentally as a practice of freedom.
I love that phrase from the text. A practice of freedom. It contrasts so sharply with how the text suggests reproductive health is usually handled in dominant heteronormative society, where it is often treated as a clinical imposition, a source of shame, or a strict set of moral prohibitions.
Furthermore, The text notes that the educational and health manuals produced for these communities, which are co-produced with these external solidarity networks, specifically and explicitly include respect for sex workers and LGBTQ+ individuals.
This inclusion isn't an afterthought or an addendum.
No, it is framed as a core foundational part of the Zapatista project of building what they call other possible worlds here and now.
It's a proactive, institutionalized effort to dismantle that default setting of heteronormativity within their own schools and clinics. Now, to be fair, the Leyva Solano text is also very honest about this reality.
It is.
It acknowledges that this process hasn't been a magical utopia. The author notes that there have been and continue to be many internal barriers of all kinds to sort through. Changing deeply ingrained cultural norms regarding gender is an ongoing, difficult struggle within the indigenous communities themselves.
But the vital takeaway from the text is that it is a concrete, institutionalized effort backed by the autonomous governance structure, not just empty rhetoric.
This deliberate, institutional, network-driven approach to resistance and community building provides a stark, almost dizzying contrast to other models of radicalization. And this is exactly where we need to bring in the other sources in our stack to understand how unique the Zapatista model truly is.
Yes, we should pivot to the terrorism and insurgency sources in the stack. Mark Sageman's Leaderless Jihad, the massive RAND Corporate here report on how terrorist groups end, and the CTC Sentinel article. Because this is where the structural contrast gets really sharp.
And just a quick reminder to our listeners, aligning with our mandatory impartiality disclaimer, we are bringing these specific sources in to look at the clinical, sociological, and structural categorizations of armed and insurgent groups.
Right.
We are doing this to draw a structural contrast between different models of resistance, radicalization, and state conflict as presented by the various authors, absolutely not to endorse any specific political views or methods.
Absolutely. So if we look at the Sageman text first, Sageman explains the process of terrorist radicalization. He's specifically looking at global jihadist movements in this text as often being driven by a profound sense of moral outrage.
Moral outrage.
Yes, according to Sageman's framework, individuals feel intense, acute moral outrage over extreme violence or perceived injustices against their community or their co-religionists. And crucially, he notes his outrage is often experienced vicariously through modern media and the internet rather than firsthand.
However, in his analysis, this profound outrage often leads to a disconnected, leaderless, and ultimately purely destructive application of kinetic violence. It's a visceral reaction that seeks to punish or destroy the perceived enemy, but it almost entirely lacks a tangible, localized program for actually building a new, functioning society.
Sageman also points out an interesting dynamic regarding where this radicalization happens, noting a divide between Europe and the United States, suggesting that local, daily grievances, social networks, and feelings of societal alienation play a massive role in whether that initial moral outrage actually metastasizes into kinetic violence.
But then we have the RAND Corporation report, which provides a massive historical data set on how these violent insurgent and terrorist groups actually end, and the data is kind of wild.
The RAND data is highly revealing and counterintuitive to how these conflicts are often portrayed. They looked at hundreds of armed groups over decades and found that the vast majority end through two primary means: routine policing and intelligence, which accounted for 40% of the ends, or political assimilation, which accounted for 43%.
43% just assimilate into the political process. I was trying to figure out how that works.
The report notes that groups rarely achieve their actual maximalist goals through pure kinetic violence. It cites examples to illustrate both ends of the spectrum.
Right.
For the policing side, they look at Aum Shinrikyo, the apocalyptic doomsday cult in Japan that carried out the horrific sarin gas attack in the Tokyo subway.
They weren't defeated by a military war.
No, they were essentially dismantled through heavy, targeted policing and criminal justice measures after their attack. The violence led to their systemic eradication.
And on the other side of the spectrum, the assimilation side, the RAND text points to groups like the FMLN in El Salvador.
Right.
After years of brutal, grinding civil war and massive insurgency against the state, the conflict ended not with a total revolutionary military victory for the insurgents, but through a negotiated peace settlement. The FMLN essentially assimilated into the traditional political process, eventually becoming a legal political party within the very state structure they had been fighting.
And the CTC Sentinel source echoes this exact sentiment, stating bluntly that terrorist groups rarely achieve their goals.
So if we look at this landscape, We have models of radicalization that lead to isolated, destructive violence that is eventually policed out of existence, or we have massive armed insurgencies that eventually compromise, lay down their weapons, and join the very political systems they spent decades trying to overthrow. It feels like a trap.
It is a historical trap, and if we connect this structural landscape to the broader picture, the primary text by Leyva Solano contrasts these traditional kinetic models heavily with the Zapatista approach.
To explain how the Zapatistas avoided this trap, the text utilizes the theory of sociologist Manuel Castells.
Yes.
Castells categorized the Zapatistas not as a traditional kinetic insurgency like the FMLN, but as the world's first informational guerrilla or a network war.
I know you kept highlighting that
I
term.
did. Informational guerrilla. What does that actually mean in practice based on the text? How did they avoid the RAND statistics?
It means that instead of relying purely on kinetic military force, which, against the full weight of the Mexican state military, would have been highly asymmetrical and likely suicidal, or descending into the kind of isolated, destructive, disconnected violence that Sageman describes, the Zapatistas executed a massive strategic pivot almost immediately after their 1994 uprising.
They recognized the limits of the gun.
Instead, they utilized early internet communications, global media, and profound political symbolism to build a massive transnational network of solidarity.
They bypassed the state military by going global.
Exactly.
The text mentions how this specific Zapatista networking strategy heavily influenced the broader global alter-globalization movement. It explicitly cites the massive 1999 WTO protests in Seattle as a direct descendant of this Zapatista network war philosophy. They exported the idea that you can fight global capitalism through global, decentralized networks.
Instead of just fighting a grinding military war of attrition, they constructed a tangible countermodel. They focused their energy inward on building local autonomy, the Merzy schools, the clinics, the agricultural co-ops we discussed, while simultaneously building an outward-facing global communication network.
The text frames this as a uniquely resilient model of resistance against global patriarchal capitalism, one that prioritizes community building, international solidarity, and crucially, the radical inclusion of diverse bodies over pure destructive force.
They are fighting the wheels of capitalism by building an entirely different vehicle.
It's a fascinating structural contrast. They didn't assimilate and they weren't policed out of existence, they networked. And this reliance on transnational networks, deep political symbolism, and a completely different kind of global presence brings us to the cinematic culmination of our deep dive.
This is the event where the historical context, the political evolution, and the highly symbolic strategy of the informational guerrilla all converge in a single remarkable recent event detailed in the text.
The text sets the scene in May of 2021. The Zapatistas launch a maritime delegation. They call it Escuadrón 421. They literally set sail across the Atlantic Ocean on a boat that they have significantly renamed La Montaña, the mountain.
And the text is very specific, and given everything we've discussed about their history, very deliberate about the makeup of the crew of Escuadrón 421.
It consists of 4 women, 2 men, and 1 otroa.
That otroa is Mara Jose, whom we've alluded to.
The text describes the landing scene on June 22, 2021. The boat arrives in the ports of Vigo and Bayona in Galicia, Spain. The author paints a vivid, almost surreal picture. Local Galician women are playing traditional bagpipes on the shore, a massive crowd is cheering, a welcoming network of European solidarity that has been built over decades of that network war is there to greet them.
It's a powerful image. But the core of this event, according to the author's analysis, is the profound symbolic contrast it creates with a very specific foundational historical moment.
Right. To understand the weight of this, the text sets up the historical resonance of the specific location they chose to land. The town of Bayona, Spain, actually sells itself to tourists based on a specific event. It heavily promotes itself as the very first port in Europe to receive the official news of the discovery of America.
This happened on March 1st, 1493, when one of Christopher Columbus's ships, the Caravel La Pinta, captained by Martin Alonso Pinzon, arrived in those exact waters after crossing from the Caribbean.
The author details how the Zapatistas orchestrated a powerful, meticulously planned symbolic inversion of that 1493 event. 528 years later, a ship arrives from the Americas to Europe.
But instead of the heavy leather boot of a European conquistador stepping off a boat to plant a flag and claim discovered land for an empire, the text describes a completely different image.
The first foot to touch the European pier is the heel of Mara Jose's boot. Marihosen and Otroa, a 39-year-old Tojolabal indigenous militia member, a community health promoter, and an education promoter.
It's a deliberate, globally broadcast subversion of the foundational historical narrative of the modern world. And the text quotes the speech that Marajose delivered upon landing, which essentially seals this symbolic inversion.
Moresi's speech is incredible. According to the text, Marihosia steps onto the dock and declares, on behalf of Zapatista women, children, men, and otras, that the land currently known as Europe will henceforth be renamed,
The new name declared for Europe is Slumil Kashemkup.
which the text translates from the indigenous language as unsubmissive earth, or earth that does not resign itself, that does not faint.
But this raises such an important point about the power of naming and the ownership of history. The text analyzes the profound symbolic weight of this single action. For 500 years, the global narrative has been one of European conquest, where the colonizer assumes the absolute right to name, claim, and define the territory and the bodies of the colonized.
But here, the text points out marginalized indigenous bodies, specifically putting women and a sexually diverse individual at the absolute forefront, in stark contrast to Columbus's all-male imperial crew cross the ocean to essentially undiscover and rename the territory of the colonizer.
It is framed by the author as a direct challenge to the dominant historical narrative that justifies the wheels of exploitation and dispossession.
It is a total conceptual inversion of the violence, that daily grinding war against women and diverse bodies that we discussed at the very beginning of this deep dive. The Zapatistas, through Marajose, reclaim agency not through the kinetic violence that the Rand report says usually fails, but through a profound, globally broadcast act of symbolic redefinition. They are asserting that they are not just survivors of the 500-year war, they are the authors of the next chapter.
It is a stunning, brilliant way to bring all the disparate threads of these sources together.
So, to summarize the immense journey we've taken today through this stack of materials, we started by facing the horrific, structural, and intimate statistics of global violence against women and trans people. We explored how the text framed this violence not as random crime, but as a systemic function of the four wheels of capitalism: exploitation, dispossession, contempt, and repression enforced by a rigid software of heteronormativity.
We then traced the Zapatista response, from the 1994 grassroots demand for women's leadership to the radical ancestral inclusion of diverse bodies and sex workers' rights in their contemporary political networks.
We contrasted this network-driven, autonomous model of resistance, the informational guerrilla building clinics and schools, with traditional kinetic models of terrorism and insurgency that so often end in policing or political assimilation. And finally, we saw this entire philosophy culminate in Marajose stepping off a boat in Spain, and Asroa renaming a continent to challenge 500 years of colonial history.
It is a remarkably dense, complex narrative that the sources weave together. It connects global macroeconomic structures directly to intimate, localized violence, and it connects historical 500-year-old trauma to contemporary, highly symbolic resistance.
It really is. And as we wrap up this massive deep dive, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final provocative thought to mull over on your own. We saw how Marajose stepped off a boat and renamed a continent to shift a 500-year-old paradigm of violence and conquest. It makes you wonder, what everyday structures, concepts, or spaces in your own life carry the invisible, accepted weight of history?
What default settings are you operating under?
And if you had the power to step onto that shore and rename them today, what new reality would you call into existence?
A profound question to consider as we close the books on these sources.
Indeed. We want to warmly thank you for joining us on this extensive deep dive. Your curiosity and your willingness to tackle these dense, challenging topics alongside us is what makes this show possible. We encourage you to keep questioning the narratives around you, keep looking closely at the structures of your own world, keep learning, and to join us next time as we unpack another stack of fascinating sources.
Thank you for listening.
Until next time.